Tonight I will be reading from the MAIDA book series by Enos Haynes Irwin, published in 1909, that features a little girl named Maida who is sickly and lame. Maida is the daughter to Jerome Buffalo Westerbrook, a well-known, successful Wall Street businessman. He decides to buy Maida a little shop in Charleston, Massachusetts, to give her a purpose and to help improve her health. But her father has only one condition: that she not tell anyone who she is or who her father is. And for the first time in her life, Maida finds true happiness, living in an ordinary neighborhood and making friends with ordinary children. And so, as always, my friend, settling comfortably under the covers, take a full, comfortable breath. And as you exhale, relax and let go. Allow any tension to just melt away, letting your body sink deeper and deeper down into the softness of your bed. There is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. So just lay back, relax, and enjoy the story. Chapter 11. Halloween. Halloween fell on Saturday that year. That made Friday a very busy time for Maida and the other members of the WMNT. In the afternoon, they all worked like beavers, making jack-o'-lanterns of the dozen pumpkins that Granny had ordered. Maida and Rosie and Dickie hollowed and scraped them. Arthur did all the hard work, the cutting out of the features, the putting in of candle holders. These pumpkin lanterns were for decoration, but Maida had ordered many paper jack-o'-lanterns for sale. The WMNTs spent the evening rearranging the shop. Maida went to bed so tired that she could hardly drag one foot after the other. Granny had to undress her. But when the school children came flocking in the next morning, she felt more than repaid for her work. The shop resounded with the "oh my's" and "oh looks" of their surprise and delight. Indeed, the room seemed full of twinkling yellow faces. Lines of them grinned in the doorway. Rows of them smirked from the shelves. A frieze, close set as peas in a pod, grimaced from the molding. The jolly-looking pumpkin jacks that Arthur had made were piled in a pyramid in the window. The biggest of them all, "He looks just like the man on the moon," Rosie said. Standing about everywhere among the lanterns were groups of little paper brownies, their tiny heads turned upwards as if in the greatest astonishment they were examining these monster beings. The jack-o'-lanterns sold like hotcakes. As for the brownies, "Granny, you'd think they were marching off the shelves," Maida said. By dark, she was diving breathlessly into her surplus stock. At the first touch of twilight, she lighted every lantern left in the place. 5 minutes afterwards, a crowd of children had gathered to gaze at the flaming faces in the window. Even the grown-ups stopped to admire the effect. More customers came and more, a great many children whom Maida had never seen before. By 6 o'clock, she had sold out her entire stock. When she sat down to dinner that night, she was a very happy little girl. "This is the best day I've had since I opened the shop," she said contentedly. She was not tired though. "I feel just like going to a party tonight. Granny, can I wear my prettiest Roman sash?" "You can wear anything you want, my lamb," Granny said. "You've been a busy little child today." Granny dressed her according to Maida's choice in white. A very simple, soft little frock it was, with many tiny tucks made by hand and many insertions of a beautiful fine lace. Maida chose to wear it with pale blue silk stockings and slippers. A sash of blue striped in pink and white, a string of pink Venetian beads. "Now, Granny, I'll read until the children call for me," she suggested, "so I won't rumple my dress." But she was too excited to read. She sat for a long time at the window, just looking out. Presently, the jack-o'-lanterns, lighted now, began to make blobs of gold in the fiery darkness of the street. She could not at first make out who held them. It was strange to watch the fiery, grinning heads flying bodiless from place to place, but she identified the lanterns in the court by the houses from which they emerged. The 3 small ones on the end at the left meant Dickie and Molly and Tim. 2 big ones, mounted on sticks, came from across the way, Rosie and Arthur, of course. 2, just alike, trotting side by side, betrayed the Clark twins. A baby lantern, swinging close to the ground, that could be nobody but Betsy. The crowd in the court began to march towards the shop. For an instant, Maida watched the spots of brilliant color dancing in her direction. Then she slipped into her coat and seized her own lantern. When she came outside, the sidewalk seemed crowded with grotesque faces, all laughing at her. "Just think," she said, "I have never been to a Halloween party in my life." "You are the strangest thing, Maida," Rosie said in perplexity. "You've been to Europe. You can talk French and Italian, and yet you've never been to a Halloween party. Did you ever hang May baskets?" Maida shook her head. "You wait until next May," Rosie prophesied gleefully. The crowd crossed over into the court. 2 motionless, yellow faces grinning at them from the Lathrop steps showed that Laura and Harold had come out to meet them. On the lawn they broke into an impromptu game of tag, which the jack-o'-lantern seemed to enjoy as much as the children. Certainly, they whizzed from place to place as quickly, and certainly they smiled as hard. The game ended, they left their lanterns on the piazza and trooped into the house. "We've got to play the first games in the kitchen," Laura announced after the coats and hats had come off and Mrs. Lathrop had greeted them all. Maida wondered what sort of party it was that was held in the kitchen, but she asked no questions. Almost bursting with curiosity, she joined the long line marching to the back of the house. In the middle of the kitchen floor stood a tub of water with apples floating in it. "Bobbing for apples!" the children exclaimed. "Oh, that's the greatest fun of all. Did you ever bob for apples, Maida?" "No." "Let Maida try it first then," Laura said. "It's very easy, Maida," she went on with twinkling eyes. "All you have to do is to kneel on the floor, clasp your hands behind you, and pick out one of the apples with your teeth. You'll each be allowed 3 minutes. "Oh, I can get half a dozen in 3 minutes, I guess," Maida said. Laura tied a big apron around Maida's waist and stood, watch in hand. The children gathered in a circle about the tub. Maida knelt on the floor, clasped her hands behind her, and reached with a wide open mouth for the nearest apple. But at the first touch of her lips, the apple bobbed away. She reached for another. That bobbed away too. Another and another and another. They all bobbed clean out of her reach, no matter how delicately she touched them. That method was unsuccessful. 1 minute, called Laura. Maida could hear the children giggling at her. She tried another scheme, making vicious little dabs at the apples. Her beads and her hair ribbon and one of her long curls dipped into the water, but she only succeeded in sending the apples spinning across the tub. 2 minutes, called Laura. "Why don't you get those half a dozen?" the children jeered. "You know you said it was so easy." Maida giggled too, but inwardly she made up her mind that she would get one of those apples if she dipped her whole head into the tub. At last, a brilliant idea occurred to her. Using her chin as a guide, she poked a big rosy apple over against the side of the tub. Wedging it there against another big apple, she held it tight. Then she dropped her head a little, gave a sudden big bite, and arose amidst applause, with the apple secure between her teeth. After that, she had the fun of watching the other children. The older ones were adepts. In 3 minutes, Rosie secured 4, Dickie 5, and Arthur 6. Rosie did not get a drop of water on her, but the boys emerged with dripping heads. The little children were not very successful, but they were more fun. Molly swallowed so much water that she choked and had to be patted on the back. Betsy, after a few snaps of her little rosebud mouth, seized one of the apples with her hand, sat down on the floor, and calmly ate it. But the climax was reached when Tim Doyle suddenly lurched forward and fell headlong into the tub. "I knew he'd fall in," Molly said in a matter-of-fact voice. "He always falls into everything. I brought a dry set of clothes for him. Come, Tim." At this announcement, everybody shrieked. Molly disappeared with Tim in the direction of Laura's bedroom. When she reappeared, sure enough, Tim had a dry suit on. Next, Laura ordered them to sit about the kitchen table. She gave each child an apple and a knife and directed him to pare the apple without breaking the peel. If you think that is an easy thing to do, try it. It seemed to Maida that she would never accomplish it. She spoiled 3 apples before she succeeded. "Now take your apple paring and form in line across the kitchen floor," Laura commanded. The flock scampered to obey her. "Now, When I say 3, she continued, throw the pairings back over your shoulder to the floor. If the pairing makes a letter, it will be the initial of your future husband or wife. 1, 2, 3. A dozen apple pairings flew to the floor. Everybody raced across the room to examine the results. Mine is B, Dickie said. And mine's an O, Rosie declared, as plain as anything. What's yours, Maida? It's an X, Maida answered in great perplexity. I don't believe that there are any names beginning with X. Well, mine's as bad, Laura laughed. It's a Z. I guess I'll be Mrs. Zero. That's nothing, Arthur laughed. Mine's an and. I can't marry anybody named and. Well, if that isn't successful, Laura said, there's another way of finding out who your husband or wife's going to be. You must walk down the cellar stairs backwards with a candle in one hand and a mirror in the other. You must look in the mirror all the time, and when you get to the foot of the stairs, you will see, reflected in it, the face of your husband or wife. This did not interest the little children, but the big ones were wild to try it. Gracious, doesn't it sound scary? Rosie said, her great eyes snapping. I love a game that's kind of spooky. Don't you, Maida? Maida did not answer. She was watching Harold, who was sneaking out of the room very quietly from a door at the side. All right then, Rosie, Laura caught her up. You can go first. The children all crowded over to the door leading to the cellar. The stairs were as dark as pitch. Rosie took the mirror and the candle that Laura handed her and slipped through the opening. The little audience listened breathless. They heard Rosie stumble awkwardly down the stairs, heard her pause at the foot. Next came a moment of silence, of waiting as tense above as below. Then came a burst of Rosie's jolly laughter. She came running up to them, her cheeks like roses, her eyes like stars. They crowded around her. What did you see? Tell us about it, they clamored. Rosie shook her head. No, she maintained. I'm not going to tell you what I saw until you've been down yourself. It was Arthur's turn next. They listened again. The same thing happened. Awkward stumbling down the stairs. A pause. Then a roar of laughter. Oh, what did you see? They implored when he reappeared. Try it yourself, he advised. I'm not going to tell. Dickie went next. Again they all listened, and to the same mysterious doings. Dickie came back smiling, but, like the others, he refused to describe his experiences. Now it was Maida's turn. She took the candle and the mirror from Dickie and plunged into the shivery darkness of the stairs. It was doubly difficult for her to go down backwards because of her lameness. But she finally arrived at the bottom and stood there expectantly. It seemed a long time before anything happened. Suddenly, she felt something stir back of her. A lighted jack-o'-lantern came from between the folds of a curtain which hung from the ceiling. It grinned over her shoulder at her face in the mirror. Maida burst into a shriek of laughter and scrambled upstairs. I'm going to marry a jack-o'-lantern, she said. My name's going to be Mrs. Jack Pumpkin. I'm going to marry Laura's sailor doll, Rosie confessed. My name is Mrs. Yankee Doodle." "I'm going to marry Laura's big doll, Queenie," Arthur admitted. "And I'm going to marry Harold's teddy bear," Dickie said. After that, they blew soap bubbles and roasted apples and chestnuts, popped corn and pulled candy at the great fireplace in the playroom. And at Maida's request, just before they left, Laura danced for them. "Will you help me to get on my costume, Maida?" Laura asked. "Of course," Maida said, wondering. "I asked you to come down here, Maida," Laura said when the two little girls were alone, "because I wanted to tell you that I am sorry for the way I treated you just before I got diphtheria. I told my mother about it, and she said I did those things because I was coming down sick. She said that people are always fretty and cross when they're not well. But I don't think it was all that. I guess I did it on purpose, just to be disagreeable. But I hope you'll excuse me." "Of course I will, Laura," Maida said heartily. "And I hope you will forgive me for going so long without speaking to you. But you see, I heard—" She stopped and hesitated. "Things," she ended lamely. "Oh, I know what you heard. I said those things about you to the WMNTs so that they'd get back to you. I wanted to hurt your feelings." Laura, in her turn, stopped and hesitated for an instant. "I was jealous," she finally confessed in a burst. "But I want you to understand this, Maida. I didn't believe those horrid things myself. I always have a feeling inside when people are telling lies, and I didn't have that feeling when you were talking to me. I knew you were telling the truth. And all the time while I was getting well, I felt so dreadfully about it that I knew I never would be happy again unless I told you so." "I did feel bad when I heard those things," Maida said. "But of course I forgot about them when Rosie told me you were ill. Let's forget all about it again." But Maida told the WMNTs something of her talk with Laura, and the result was an invitation to Laura to join the club. It was accepted gratefully. The next month went by on wings. It was a busy month, although in a way it was an uneventful one. The weather kept clear and fine. Little rain fell, but, on the other hand, to the great disappointment of the little people of Primrose Court, there was no snow. Maida saw nothing of her father, for business troubles kept him in New York. He wrote constantly to her, and she wrote as faithfully to him. Letters could not quite fill the gap that his absence made. Perhaps Billy suspected Maida's secret loneliness, for he came oftener and oftener to see her. One night, the WMNTs begged so hard for a story that he finally began one called The Crystal Ball. A wonderful thing about it was that it was half game and half story. Most wonderful of all, it went on from night to night and never showed any signs of coming to an end. But in order to play this game story, there were 2 or 3 conditions to which you absolutely must submit. For instance, it must always be played in the dark. At first, everybody must shut his eyes tight. Billy would say in a deep voice, "Abracadabra," and presto, there they all were, Maida, Rosie, Laura, Billy, Arthur, and Dickie inside the crystal ball. What people lived there and what things happened to them cannot be told here. But after an hour or more, Billy's deepest voice would boom, "Abracadabra," again, and presto, there they were all again, back in the cheerful living room. Maida hoped against hope that her father would come to spend Thanksgiving with her, but he finally wrote and said it was impossible. Billy came, however, and they three enjoyed one of Granny's delicious turkey dinners. "I hope that I would have found your daughter Annie by this time, Granny," Billy said. "But I'll find her yet. You'll see." "I hope so, Mr. Billy," Granny said respectfully, but Maida thought her voice sounded as if she had no great hope. Dickie still continued to come for his reading lessons, although Maida could see that in a month or two he would not need a teacher. One afternoon after Thanksgiving, Maida ran over to Dickie's to borrow some pink tissue paper. She knocked gently. Nobody answered, but from the room came the sound of sobbing. Maida listened. It was Dickie's voice. At first she did not know what to do. Finally, she opened the door and peeped in. Dickie was sitting all crumpled up, his head resting on the table. "Oh, what is the matter, Dickie?" Maida asked. Dickie jumped. He raised his head and looked at her. His face was swollen with crying, his eyes red and heavy. For a moment he could not speak. Maida could see that he was ashamed of being caught in tears, that he was trying hard to control himself. "It's something I heard," he replied at last. "What?" Maida asked. "Last night after I got to bed, Doc O'Brien came here to get his bill paid. Mother thought I was asleep and asked him a whole lot of questions. He told her that I wasn't any better and I never would be any better. He said that I'd be a cripple for the rest of my life." In spite of all his efforts, Dickie's voice broke into a sob. "Oh, Dickie, Dickie," Maida said. Better than anybody else in the world, Maida felt that she could understand, could sympathize. "Oh, Dickie, how sorry I am." "I can't bear it," Dickie said. He put his head down on the table and began to sob. "I can't bear it," he said. "Why, I thought when I grew up to be a man, I was going to take care of Mother and Delia. Instead of that, they'll be taking care of me. What can a cripple do?" Once I read about a crippled newsboy. "Do you suppose I could sell papers?" he asked with a gleam of hope. "I'm sure you could," Maida said heartily, "and a great many other things. But it may not be as bad as you think, Dickie. Dr. O'Brien may be mistaken. You know something was wrong with me when I was born, and I did not begin to walk until a year ago. My father has taken me to so many doctors that I'm sure he could not remember half their names. But they all said the same thing, that I never would walk like other children. Then a very great physician, Dr. Grindschmidt, came from away across the sea from Germany. He said he could cure me, and he did. I had to be operated on and, oh, I suffered dreadfully. But you see that I'm all well now. I'm even losing my limp. Now, I believe that Dr. Grindschmidt can cure you. The next time my father comes home, I'm going to ask him." Dickie had stopped crying. He was drinking down everything that she said. "Is he still here, that doctor?" he asked. "No," Maida admitted sorrowfully. "But there must be doctors as good as he somewhere. But don't you worry about it at all, Dickie. You wait until my father sees you. He always gets everything made right." "When's your father coming home?" "I don't quite know, but I look for him any time now." Dickie started to set the table. "I guess I wouldn't have cried," he said after a while, "if I could have cried last night when I first heard it. But of course I couldn't let Mother or Doc O'Brien know that I'd heard them. It would make them feel bad. I don't want my mother ever to know that I know it." After that, Maida redoubled her efforts to be nice to Dickie. She cudgeled her brains too for new decorative schemes for his paperwork. She asked Billy Potter to bring a whole bag of her books from the Beacon Street house, and she lent them to Dickie, a half a dozen at a time. Indeed, they were a very busy quartet, the WMNTs. Rosie went to school every day. She climbed out of her window no more at night. She seemed to prefer helping Maida in the shop to anything else. Arthur Duncan was equally industrious. With no Rosie to play hooky with, he, too, was driven to attending school regularly. His leisure hours were devoted to his whittling and wood carving. He was always doing kind things for Maida and Granny, bringing up the coal, emptying the ashes, running errands. And so November passed into December. Chapter 12. The First Snow. "Look out of the window, my lamb," Granny called one morning early in December. Maida opened her eyes, jumped obediently out of bed, and pattered across the room. There she gave a scream of delight, jumping up and down and clapping her hands. "Snow! Oh, goody, goody, goody! Snow at last!" It looked as if the whole world had been wrapped in a blanket of the whitest, fleeciest, shiniest wool. Sidewalks, streets, crossings were all leveled to one smoothness. The fences were so muffled that they had swelled to twice their size. The houses wore trim, pointy caps on their gables. The high bushes in the yard hung to the very ground. The low ones had become mounds. The trees looked as if they had been packed in cotton wool and put away for the winter. "And the lovely part of it is it's still snowing," Maida exclaimed blissfully. Maida dressed in the greatest excitement. Few children came in to make purchases that morning, and the lines pouring into the schoolhouse were very shivery and much shorter than usual. At 11:45, the one-session bell rang. When the children came out of school at 1, the snow was whirling down thicker and faster than in the morning. A high wind came up and piled it in the most unexpected places. Trade stopped entirely in the shop. No mother would let her children brave so terrific a storm. It snowed that night and all the next morning. The second day, fewer children went to school than on the first. But at 2 o'clock, when the sun burst through the gray sky, the children swarmed the streets. Shovels and brooms began to appear, snowballs to fly, sleigh bells to tinkle. Rosie came dashing into the shop in the midst of this burst of excitement. "I've shoveled our sidewalk," she announced triumphantly. "Is anything wrong with me? Everybody's staring at me." Maida stared too. Rosie's scarlet cape was dotted with snow. Her scarlet hat was white with it. Great flakes had caught in her long black hair, had starred her soft brows. They hung from her very eyelashes. Her cheeks and lips were the color of coral, and her eyes like great velvety moons. "You look in the glass and see what they're staring at," Maida said slyly. Rosie went to the mirror. I don't see anything the matter." "It's because you look so pretty, Goose," Maida exclaimed. Rosie always blushed and looked ashamed if anybody alluded to her prettiness. Now she leaped to Maida's side and pretended to beat her. "Stop that," a voice called. Startled, the little girls looked up. Billy stood in the doorway. "I've come over to make a snow house," he explained. "Oh, Billy, what things you think of," Maida exclaimed. "Wait till I get Arthur and Dickie." "Couldn't get many more in here, could we?" Billy commented when the 5 had assembled in the child-sized yard. "I don't know that we could stow away another shovel. Now, first of all, you're to pile all the snow in the yard into that corner." Everybody went to work, but Billy and Arthur moved so quickly with their big shovels that Maida and Rosie and Dickie did nothing but hop about them. Almost before they realized it, the snow pile reached to the top of the fence. "Pack it down hard," Billy commanded, "as hard as you can make it." Everybody scrambled to obey. For a few moments, the sound of shovels beating on the snow drowned their talk. "That will do for that," Billy commanded suddenly. His little force stopped, breathless and red-cheeked. "Now I'm going to dig out the room. I guess I'll have to do this. If you're not careful enough, the roof will cave in. Then it's all got to be done again." Working very slowly, he began to hollow out the structure. After the hole had grown big enough, he crawled into it. But in spite of his own warning, he must have been too energetic in his movements. Suddenly, the roof came down on his head. Billy was on his feet in an instant, shaking the snow off as a dog shakes off water. "Why, Billy, you look like a snowman," Maida laughed. "I feel like one," Billy said, wiping the snow from his eyes and from under his collar. "But don't be discouraged, my hearties. Up with it again. I'll be more careful the next time." They went at it again with increased interest, heaping up a mound of snow bigger than before, beating it until it was as hard as a brick, hollowing out inside a chamber big enough for 3 of them to occupy at once. But Billy gave them no time to enjoy their new dwelling. "Run into the house," was his next order, "and bring out all the water you can carry." There was a wild scramble to see which would get to the sink first, but in a few moments, an orderly file emerged from the house. Arthur with a bucket, Dickie with a basin, Rosie with the dishpan, Maida with a dipper. "Now I'm going to pour water over the house," Billy explained. "You see, if it freezes now, it will last longer." Very carefully, he sprayed it on the sides of the roof, dashing it upwards on the inside walls. "We might as well make it look pretty while we're about it," Billy continued. "You children get to work and make a lot of snowballs the size of an orange and just as round as you can turn them out." This was easy work. Before Billy could say Jack Robinson, 4 pairs of eager hands had accumulated snowballs enough for a sham battle. In the meantime, Billy had decorated the doorway with 2 tall, round pillars. He added a pointed roof to the house and trimmed it with snowballs all along the edge. "Now I guess we'd better have a snowman to live in this mansion while we're about it," Billy suggested briskly. "Each of you roll up an arm or a leg while I make the body." Billy placed the legs in the corner opposite the snow house. He lifted onto them the big round body which he himself had rolled. Putting the arms on was not easy. He worked for a long time before he found the angle at which they would stick. Everybody took a hand at the head. Maida contributed some dulse for the hair, slitting it into ribbons, which she stuck on with glue. Rosie found a broken clothespin for the nose. The round, smooth coals that Dickie discovered in the coal hod made a pair of expressive black eyes. Arthur cut 2 sets of teeth from orange peel and inserted them in the gash that was the mouth. When the head was set on the shoulders, Billy disappeared into the house for a moment. He came back carrying a suitcase. "Shut your eyes, every man jack of you," he ordered. "You're not to see what I do until it's done. If I catch one of you peeking, I'll confine you in the snow house for 5 minutes." The WMNTs shut their eyes tight and held down their lids with fingers, but they kept their ears wide open. The mysterious work on which Billy was engaged was accompanied by the most tantalizing noises. "Oh, Billy, can't I please look?" Maida begged, jiggling up and down. "I can't stand it much longer." "In a minute," Billy said encouragingly. The mysterious noises kept up. "Now," Billy said suddenly. 4 pairs of eyes leaped open. 4 pairs of lips shrieked their delight. Indeed, Maida and Rosie laughed so hard that they finally rolled in the snow. Billy had put on an old coat on the snowman's body. He had put a tall hat, Arthur called it a stovepipe, on the snowman's head. He had put an old black pipe between the snowman's grinning orange-colored teeth. Gloves hung limply from the snowman's arm stumps, and to one of them a cane was fastened. Billy had managed to give the snowman's head a cock to one side. Altogether, he looked so spruce and jovial that it was impossible not to like him. "Mr. Chumpley, ladies and gentlemen," Billy said. And Mr. Chumpley he was until... Billy stayed that night to dinner. They had just finished eating when an excited ring of the bell announced Rosie. "Oh, Granny," she said, "the boys have made a most wonderful coast down Holywell Street, and Aunt Teresa says I can go coasting until 9 o'clock if you'll let Maida go too. I thought maybe you would, especially if Billy comes along." "If Mr. Billy goes, that'll be all right." "Oh, Granny," Maida said, "you dear, darling old fairy dame." She was so excited that she wriggled like a little eel all the time Granny was bundling her into clothes. And when she reached the street, it seemed as if she must explode. A big moon, floating like a silver balloon in the sky, made the night like day. The neighborhood sizzled with excitement, for the street and sidewalks were covered with children dragging sleds. "It's like the Pied Piper, Rosie," Maida said joyfully. "Children everywhere and all going in the same direction." They followed the procession up Warrington Street to where Holywell Street sloped down the hill. Billy let out a long whistle of astonishment. "Great Scott, what a coast," he said. In the middle of the street was a ribbon of ice 3 feet wide and as smooth as glass. At the foot of the hill, a piled-up mound of snow served as a buffer. "The boys have been working on the slide all day," Rosie said. "Did you ever see such a nice one, Maida?" "I never saw any kind of a one," Maida confessed. "How do they make it so smooth?" "Pouring water on it." "Have you never coasted before, Maida?" Billy asked. "Never." "Well, here's your chance then," said a cheerful voice back of them. They all turned. There stood Arthur Duncan with what Maida soon learned was a double runner. Billy examined it carefully. "Did you make it, Arthur?" "Yes." "Pretty good piece of work," Billy commented. "Want to try it, Maida?" "I'm crazy to." "All right, pile on." Arthur took his place in front. Rosie sat next, then Dickie, then Maida, then Billy. "Hold on to Dickie," Billy instructed Maida, "and I'll hold on to you." Tingling with excitement, Maida did as she was told, but it seemed as if they would never start. But at last she heard Billy's voice. "On your marks, get set, go!" The double runner stirred. It moved slowly for a moment across the level top of the street. Then came the first slope of the hill. They plunged forward. She heard Rosie's hysterical shriek, Dickie's cheers, and Billy's blood-curdling yells, but she herself was as silent as a little image. They struck the second slope of the hill. Then she screamed too. The houses on either side shot past like pictures in the kinetoscope. She felt a rush of wind that must surely blow her ears off. They reached the third slope of the hill, and now they had left the earth and were sailing through the air. The next instant, the double runner had come to rest on the bank of snow, and Rosie and she were hugging each other and saying, "Wasn't it great?" They climbed to the top of the hill again. All the way back, Maida watched the sleds whizzing down the coast, boys alone on sleds, girls alone on sleds, pairs of girls, pairs of boys, one seated in front, the other steering with a foot that trailed behind on the ice. Timid little girls who did not dare the ice, but contented themselves with sliding on the snow at either side. Daring little boys who went down lying flat on their sleds. At the top, they were besieged with entreaties to go on the double runner, and, as there was room enough for one more, they took a little boy or girl with them each time. Rosie lent her sled to those who had none. At first there were plenty of these, standing at the top of the coast, wistfully watching the fun of more fortunate children. But after a while, it was discovered that the ice was so smooth that almost anything could be used for coasting. The sledless ones rushed home and reappeared with all kinds of things. One little lad went down on a shovel, and his intrepid little sister followed on a broom. Boxes and shingles and even dishpans began to appear. Most reckless of all, one big fellow slid down on his 2 feet, landing in a heap in the snow. Maida enjoyed every moment of it, even the long walks back up the hill. Once, the double runner struck into a riderless sled that had drifted onto the course and was overturned immediately. Nobody was hurt. Rosie, Dickie, and Arthur were cast safely to one side in the soft snow, but Maida and Billy were thrown whirling onto the ice. Billy kept his grip on Maida, and they shot down the hill, turning round and round and round. At first, Maida was a little frightened, but when she saw that they were perfectly safe, that Billy was making her spin about in that ridiculous fashion, she laughed so hard that she was weak when they reached the bottom. "Oh, let's do that again," she said when she caught her breath. Never was such a week as followed. The cold weather kept up. Continued storms added to the snow. For the first time in years came 4 one-session days in a single week. It seemed as if Jack Frost were on the side of the children. He would send violent flurries of snow just before the one-session bell rang, but as soon as the children were safely on the street, the sun would come out bright as summer. Every morning when Maida woke up, she would say to herself, "I wonder how Mr. Chumpley is today." Then she would run over to the window to see. Mr. Chumpley had become a great favorite in the neighborhood. He was so tall that his round, happy face with its eternal orange peel grin could look straight over the fence to the street. The passers-by used to stop, paralyzed by the vision. But after studying the phenomena, they would go on laughing on their way. Occasionally, a bad boy would shy a snowball at the smiling countenance, but Mr. Chumpley was so hard-headed that nothing seemed to hurt him. In the course of time, the stovepipe became very battered, and as the result of continued storms, one eye sank down to the middle of his cheek. But in spite of his injuries, he continued to maintain his genial grin. "Let's go out and fix Mr. Chumpley," Rosie would say every day. The two little girls would brush the snow off his hat and coat, adjust his nose and teeth, would straighten him up generally. After a while, Maida threw her bird crumbs all over Mr. Chumpley. Thereafter, the saucy little English sparrows ate from Mr. Chumpley's hat brim, his pipe bowl, even his pockets. "Perhaps the snow will last all winter," Maida said hopefully one day. "If it does, Mr. Chumpley's health will be perfect." "Well, perhaps it's just as well if he goes," Rosie said sensibly. "We haven't done a bit of work since he came." On Sunday, the weather moderated a little. Mr. Chumpley bore a most melancholy look all the afternoon, as if he feared what was to come. What was worse, he lost his nose. Monday morning, Maida ran to the window, dreading what she might see. But instead of the thaw she expected, a most beautiful sight spread out before her. The weather had turned cold in the night. Everything that had started to melt had frozen up again. The sidewalks were like frosted cakes. Long icicles made pretty fringes around the roofs of the houses. The trees and bushes were glazed by a sheathing of crystal. The sunlight playing through all this turned the world into a heap of diamonds. Mr. Chumpley had perked up under the influence of the cold. His manner had gained in solidity, although his gaze was a little glassy. Hopefully, Maida hunted about until she found his nose. She replaced his old set with some new orange peel teeth and stuck his pipe between them. He looked quite himself. But, alas, the sun came out and melted the whole world. The sidewalks trickled streams. The icicles dripped away in showers of diamonds. The trees lost their crystal sheathing. In the afternoon, Mr. Chumpley began to droop. By night, his head was resting disconsolately on his own shoulder. When Maida looked out the next morning, there was nothing in the corner but a mound of snow. An old coat lay to one side. Strewn about were a hat, a pair of gloves, a pipe, and a cane. Mr. Chumpley had passed away in the night. Chapter 13, The Fair. Save your pennies. A Christmas fair will be held in this shop the Saturday before Christmas. Delicious candies made by Miss Rosie Brine. Paper goods designed and executed by Master Richard Dorr. Wood carving designed and executed by Master Arthur Duncan. Don't miss it. This sign hung in Maida's window for a week. Billy made it. The lettering was red and gold. In one corner, he painted a picture of a little boy and girl in their nightgowns peeking up a chimney place hung with stockings. In the other corner, the full moon face of a Santa Claus popped like a jolly jack-in-the-box from a chimney top. A troop of reindeer, dragging a sleigh full of toys, scurried through the printing. The whole thing was enclosed in a wreath of holly. The sign attracted a great deal of attention. Children were always stopping to admire it, and even grown people paused now and then. There was such a falling off of Maida's trade that she guessed that the children were really saving their pennies for the fair. This delighted her. The WMNTs wasted no time that last week, in spite of a very enticing snowstorm. Maida, of course, had nothing to do on her own account, but she worked with Dickie morning and afternoon. Rosie could not make candy until the last 2 or 3 days, for fear it would get stale. Then she set to like a little whirlwind. "My face is almost tanned from bending over the stove," she said to Maida. "Aunt Teresa says if I cook another batch of candy, I'll have a crop of freckles." Arthur seemed to work the hardest of all because his work was so much more difficult. It took a great deal of time and strength, and yet nobody could help him in it. The sound of his hammering came into Maida's room early in the morning. It came in sometimes late at night when, cuddling between her blankets, she thought what a happy girl she was. "I never saw such fine busy little folks," Granny said approvingly again and again. "It reminds me of my own Annie. Oh, I wonder what she's doing and thinking this Christmas." "Don't you worry," Maida always said. "Billy'll find her for you yet. He said he would." Maida herself was giving, for the first time in her experience, a good deal of thought to Christmas time. In the first place, she had sent the following invitation to every child in Primrose Court. "Will you please come to my Christmas tree to be given Christmas night in the little shop, Maida." In the second place, she was spying on all her friends, listening to their talk, watching them closely in work and play to find just the right thing to give them. "Do you know, I never made a Christmas present in my life," she said one day to Rosie. "You never made a Christmas present?" Rosie repeated. Maida's quick perception sensed in Rosie's face an unspoken accusation of selfishness. "It wasn't because I didn't want to, Rosie dear," Maida hastened to explain. "It was because I was too sick. You see, I was always in bed. I was too weak to make anything, and I could not go out and buy presents as other children did. But people used to give me the loveliest things." "What did they give you?" Rosie asked curiously. "Oh, all kinds of things. Father's given me an automobile and a pair of ponies and a family of 20 dolls and my weight in silver dollars. I can't remember half the things I've had." "A pair of ponies, an automobile, a family of 20 dolls, your weight in silver dollars? Why, Maida, you're dreaming or you're out of your head." "Out of my head? Why, Rosie, you're out of your head. Don't you suppose I know what I got for Christmas?" Maida's eyes began to flash and her lips to tremble. "Well now, Maida, just think of it," Rosie said in her most reasonable voice. "Here you are, a little girl just like anybody else, only you're running a shop. Now just as if you could afford to have an automobile. Why, my father knows a man who knows another man who bought an automobile, and it cost $900. What did yours cost?" $2,000. Maida said this with a guilty air in spite of her knowledge of her own truth. Rosie smiled roguishly. "Maida, dear," she coaxed, "you dreamed it." Maida started to her feet. For a moment she came near saying something very saucy indeed, but she remembered in time. Of course nobody in the neighborhood knew that she was Buffalo Westerbrook's daughter. It was impossible for her to prove any of her statements. The flash died out of her eyes, but another flash came into her cheeks, the flash of dimples. "Well, perhaps I did dream it, Rosie," she said archly. "But I don't think I did," she added in a quiet voice. Rosie turned the subject tactfully. "What are you going to give your father?" she asked. "That's bothering me dreadfully," Maida sighed. "I can't think of anything he needs." "Why don't you buy him the same thing I'm going to get my papa?" Rosie suggested eagerly. "That is, I'm going to buy it if I make enough money at the fair. Does your father shave himself?" "Oh, Adolph, his valet, always shaves him," Maida answered. Rosie's brow knit over the word valet, but Maida was always puzzling the neighborhood with strange expressions. Then her brow lightened. "My father goes to a barber too," she said. "I've heard him complaining lots of times how expensive it is. And the other day, Arthur told me about a razor his father uses. He says it's just like a lawnmower or a carpet sweeper. You don't have to have anybody shave you if you have one of them. You run it right over your face and it takes all the beard off and doesn't cut or anything. Now, wouldn't you think that would be fun?" "I should think it would be just lovely," Maida agreed. "That's just the thing for Papa, for he's so busy. How much does it cost, Rosie?" "About $1, Arthur thought. "I never paid so much for a Christmas present in my life, and I'm not sure yet that I can get one. But if I do sell $2 worth of candy, I can buy something perfectly beautiful for both father and mother." "Oh, Rosie," Maida asked breathlessly, "do you mean that your mother's coming back?" Rosie's face changed. "Don't you think I'd tell you that the first thing?" "No, she hasn't come back, and they don't say anything about her coming back. But if she ever does come, I guess I'm going to have her Christmas present all ready for her." Maida patted her hand. "She's coming back," she said. "I know it." Rosie sighed. "You come down Main Street the night before Christmas. Dickie and I are going to buy our Christmas presents then, and we can show you where to get the little razor." "I'd love to," Maida beamed. And indeed, it seemed the most fascinating prospect in the world to her. Every night after she went to bed, she thought it over. She was really going to buy Christmas presents without any grown-up person about to interfere. It was rapture. The night before the fair, the children worked even harder than the night before Halloween, for there were so many things to display. It was evident that the stock would overflow windows and shelves and showcases. "We'll bring the long kitchen table in for your things, Arthur," Maida decided after a perplexed consideration of the subject. "Dickie's and Rosie's things ought to go on the shelves and into the showcases where nobody can handle them." They tugged the table into the shop and covered it with a beautiful old blue counterpane. "That's fine," Arthur approved, unpacking his handicraft from the bushel baskets in which he brought them. The others stood round admiring the treasures and helping him to arrange them prettily. A fleet of graceful little boats occupied one end of the table, piles of breadboards, rolling pins, and cats the other. In the center lay a bowl filled with tiny baskets carved from peach stones. From the molding hung a fringe of hockey sticks. Having arranged all Arthur's things, The quartet filed upstairs to the closet where Dickie's paperwork was kept. "Gracious, I didn't realize there were so many," Rosie said. "Sure, the lad has worked day and night," Granny said, patting Dickie's thin cheek. They filled Arthur's baskets and trooped back to the shop. They lined showcase and shelves with the glittering things. Boxes, big and little, gorgeously ornamented with stars and moons, caps of gold and silver, flying gay plumes, rainbow boats too beautiful to sail on anything but fairy seas, miniature jackets and trousers that only a circus rider would wear. "Dickie, I never see anything look so lovely," Maida said, shaking her hands with delight. "I really didn't realize how pretty they were." Dickie's big eyes glowed with satisfaction. "Nor me neither," he confessed. "And now," Maida said, bubbling over with suppressed importance, "Rosie's candies. I've saved that until the last." She pulled out one of the drawers under the showcase and lifted it onto the counter. It was filled with candy boxes of paper, prettily decorated with flower patterns on the outside, with fringes of lace paper on the inside. "I ordered these boxes for you, Rosie," she explained. "I knew your candy would sell better if it was put up nicely. I thought the little ones could be 5-cent size, the middle-sized ones 10-cent size, and the big ones 25-cent size." Rosie was dancing up and down with delight. "They're just lovely, Maida, and how sweet you were to think of it. But it was just like you." "Now we must pack them," Maida said. 4 pairs of hands made light work of this. By 9 o'clock, all the boxes were filled and spread out temptingly in the showcase. By 9:15, 3 of the WMNTs were in bed trying hard to get sleep, but Maida stayed up. The boxes were not her only surprise. After the others had gone, she and Granny worked for half an hour in the little shop. The Saturday before Christmas dawned clear and fair. Rosie hallooed for Dickie and Arthur as she came out of doors at 7:30, and all 3 arrived at the shop together. Their faces took on such a comic look of surprise that Maida burst out laughing. "But where did it all come from?" Rosie asked in bewilderment. "Maida, you sly boots, you must have done this all after we left." Maida nodded. But all Arthur and Dickie said was, "Gee," and "Jiminy crickets." But Maida found these exclamatives quite as expressive as Rosie's hugs, and indeed, she herself thought the place worthy of any degree of admiring enthusiasm. The shop was so strung with garlands of Christmas green that it looked like a bower. Bunches of mistletoe and holly added their colors to the holiday cheer. Red Christmas bells hung everywhere. "My goodness, I never passed such a day in my life," Maida said that night at dinner. She was telling it all to Granny, who had been away on mysterious business of her own. "It's been like a beehive here ever since 8 o'clock this morning. If we'd each of us had an extra pair of hands at our knees and another at our waists, perhaps we could have begun to wait on all the people." "I'm sure it was no more than you deserved for being such busy little bees," Granny approved. "The only trouble was," Maida went on smilingly, "that they liked everything so much that they could not decide which they wanted most. Of course, the boys preferred Arthur's carvings, and the girls Rosie's candy, but it was hard to say who liked Dickie's things the best." Granny twinkled with delight. She had never told Maida, but she did not need to tell her, that Dickie was her favorite. And then the grown people who came, Granny. First Arthur's father on his way to work. Then Mrs. Lathrop and Laura. They brought loads of things. And Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Doyle, and even Mr. Flanagan bought a hockey stick. He said, Maida dimpled with delight, he said he bought it to use on Arthur and Rosie if they ever hooked Jack again. Poor Miss Allison bought one of Arthur's cats. What do you suppose for? Granny had no idea. To wind her wool on. Then Billy came at the last minute and bought everything that was left. And just think, Granny, there was a crowd of little boys and girls who had stood about watching all day without any money to spend, and Billy divided among them all the things he bought. Guess how much money they made? Granny guessed 3 sums, and each time Maida said triumphantly, "More." At last, Granny had to give it up. Arthur made $5.30. Dickie made $3.87. Rosie made $2.70. After dinner that night, Maida accompanied Rosie and Dickie on the Christmas shopping expedition. They went first to a big dry goods store with Dickie. They helped Dickie to pick out a fur collar for his mother from a counter marked $2.98. The one they selected was of gray and brown fur. Dickie's face shone with delight when at last he tucked the big round box safely under his arm. "Just think, I've been planning to do this for 3 years," he said, "and I never could have done it now if it hadn't been for you, Maida." Next, Dickie took the 2 little girls where they could buy razors. "The kind that goes like a lawnmower," Rosie explained to the proprietor. The man stared hard before he showed them his stock, but he was very kind and explained to them exactly how the wonderful little machine worked. Maida noticed that Rosie examined very carefully all the things displayed in windows and on counters, but nothing she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she did not buy. "What is it, Rosie?" Maida asked after a while. "I'm looking for something for my mother." "I'll help you," Maida said. She took Rosie's hand and, thus linked together, the 2 little girls discussed everything that they saw. Suddenly, Rosie uttered a little cry of joy and stopped at a jeweler's window. A tray with the label "Solid Silver, $1" overflowed with the little heart-shaped pendants. "Mama'd love one of those," Rosie said. She just loved things she could hang round her neck. They went inside. "It's just what I want," Rosie declared, "but I wish I had a little silver chain for it. I can't afford one, though," she concluded wistfully. "I know what to do," Maida said. "Buy a piece of narrow black velvet ribbon. Once my father gave my mother a beautiful diamond heart. Mother used to wear it on a black velvet ribbon. Afterwards, Papa bought her a chain of diamonds, but she always liked the black velvet best, and so did Papa, and so did I. Papa said it made her neck look whiter." The other 3 children looked curiously at Maida when she said diamond heart. When she said string of diamonds, they looked at each other. "Was that another of your dreams, Maida?" Rosie asked mischievously. "Dreams," Maida repeated, firing up. But before she could say anything that she would regret, the dimples came. "Perhaps it was a dream," she said prettily. "But if it was, then everything's a dream." "I believe every word that Maida says," Dickie protested stoutly. "I believe that Maida believes it," Arthur said with a smile. They all stopped with Rosie while she bought the black velvet ribbon and strung the heart on it. She packed it neatly away in the glossy box in which the jeweler had done it up. If my mama doesn't come back to wear that heart, nobody else ever will, she said passionately. Never, 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 unless I have a little girl of my own someday. Your mother'll come back, Maida said. Chapter 14, Christmas Happenings. Maida was awakened early Christmas morning by a long, wild peal of the bell. Before she could collect her scattered wits, she heard Rosie's voice. "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Oh, Granny, won't you please let me run upstairs and wake Maida? I've got something dreadfully important to tell her." Maida heard Granny's bewildered, "All right, child," heard Rosie's rush through the living room, and then she bounded out of bed, prickling all over with excitement. "Maida," Rosie called from the stairs, "wake up! I've something wonderful to tell you." But Maida had guessed it. "I know," she cried as Rosie burst into the room. "Your mother's come home." "My mother's come home," Rosie echoed. The two little girls seized each other and hopped around the room in a mad dance. Maida chanting in a deep sing-song, "Your mother's come home," and Rosie screaming at the top of her lungs, "My mother's come home." After a few moments of this, they sank exhausted on the bed. "Tell me all about it," Maida gasped. "Begin at the very beginning and don't leave anything out." "Well then," Rosie began, "I will. When I went to bed last night after leaving you, I got to thinking of my mother, and pretty soon I was so sad that I nearly cried my eyes out. Well, after a long while I got to sleep, and I guess I must have been very tired, for I didn't wake up the way I do generally of my own accord. Aunt Teresa had to wake me. She put on my best dress and did my hair this new way and even let me put cologne on. I couldn't think why, because I never dress up until afternoons. Once when I looked at her, I saw there were tears in her eyes, and oh, Maida, it made me feel something awful, for I thought she was going to tell me that my mother was dead. When I came downstairs, my father hugged me and kissed me and sat with me while I ate my breakfast. Oh, I was so afraid he was going to tell me that Mother was dead, but he didn't. After a while, he said, "Your Christmas presents are all up in your mother's bedroom, Rosie." So I skipped up there. My father and Aunt Teresa didn't come with me, but I noticed they stood downstairs and listened. I opened the door. Rosie stopped for a breath. "Go on," Maida entreated. "Oh, do hurry." "Well, there, lying on the bed, was my mother, Maida. I felt so strange that I couldn't move. My feet wouldn't walk, just like in a dream. My mother said, 'Come here, my precious little girl.' But it sounded as if it came from way, way off. And Maida, then I could move. I ran across the room and hugged her and kissed her until I couldn't breathe. Then she said, 'I have a beautiful Christmas gift for you, little daughter,' and she pulled something over towards me that lay all wrapped up in a shawl on the bed. What do you think it was?" "I don't know. Tell me, Rosie." "Guess," Rosie insisted, her eyes dancing. "Rosie, if you don't tell me this minute, I'll pinch you." "It was a baby, a little baby brother." "A baby? Oh, Rosie!" The two little girls hopped about the room in another mad dance. Maida, he's the sweetest baby that ever was in the whole wide world. His name is Edward. He's only 6 weeks old and he can smile. Smile, Rosie? He can. I saw him. And sneeze. Sneeze, Rosie? That's not all, said Rosie proudly. He can wink his eyes and double up his fists and a whole lot of things. There's no doubt that he's a remarkable baby. My mother says so. And pretty as... Oh, he's prettier than any puppy I ever saw. He's a little too pink in the face, and he hasn't much hair yet. There's a funny spot in the top of his head that goes up and down all the time that you have to be dreadfully careful about. But he certainly is the loveliest baby I ever saw. What do you think my mother let me do? Oh, what? She let me rock him for a moment, and I asked her if you could rock him someday, and she said you could. Oh. And what else do you think she's going to let me do? I can't guess. Oh, tell me, quick, Rosie. She says she's going to let me give him his bath Saturday and Sundays and wheel him out every day in his carriage. Rosie, Maida said impressively, you ought to be the happiest little girl in the world. Think of having a baby brother for a Christmas present. You will let me wheel him sometimes, won't you? Of course I will. I shall divide him exactly in half with you. Where has your mother been all this time? Maida asked. Oh, she's been dreadfully sick in a hospital. She was sick after the baby came to her. So sick that she couldn't even take care of him. She said they were afraid she was going to die, but she's all right now. Father bought her for Christmas a beautiful, long red silk dress that's just to lie down in. She looks like a queen in it, and yet she looks like a little girl too, for her hair is done in 2 braids. Her hair comes way down below her waist like your mother's hair. And when I gave her the little silver heart, she was so pleased with it. She put it right on, and it looked sweet. She said she would much rather wear it on a black velvet ribbon than on a silver chain. Everything's come out all right, hasn't it? Maida said with ecstasy. I guess it has. Now I must go. I want to be sure to be there when the baby wakes up. I asked my mother when you could see the baby, Maida, and she said tomorrow. I can't wait to show you its feet. You never did see such little toes in your life. Exciting as this event was, it was nothing to what followed. Granny and Maida were still talking about Rosie's happiness when Billy Potter suddenly came marching through the shop and into the living room. Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, they all said at once. Granny, Billy asked immediately, if you could have your choice of all the Christmas gifts in the world, which one would you choose? An expression of bewilderment came into Granny's bright blue eyes. A Christmas gift, Mr. Billy? She said in an uncertain tone. I can't think of anything as long as I can't have my little Annie with me. Maida saw Billy's eyes snap and sparkle at the word Annie. She wondered what... Could it be possible that... She began to tremble. And so you'd choose your daughter, Granny? Billy questioned. Choose my daughter? Of course I would. Granny stopped to stare in astonishment at Billy. Oh, Billy, if you could only find her. She gazed imploringly at him. Billy continued to smile at her, his eyes all scrinkled up. Granny jumped to her feet. She seized Billy's arm. Oh, Mr. Billy, you have found her? She quavered. Billy nodded. I found her, Granny. I told you I would, and I have. Now don't get excited. She's all right, and you're all right, and everything's all right. She'll be here just as soon as you're ready to see her." For a moment, Maida was afraid Granny was going to faint, for she dropped back into her chair and her eyes filled with tears. But the old fire came back to her eyes, the color to her cheeks. "Oh, I want to see her at once," she said with spirit. "Listen," Billy said. "Last night I happened to fall into conversation with a young Irishman who had come to read the gas meter in my house. I asked him where he came from. He said, Aldegarry, County Sligo. I asked him if he knew Annie Flynn. Sure, didn't she marry my cousin? She lives... Well, the short of it is, I went right over to see her, though it was late then. I found her a widow with 2 children. She nearly went crazy at the prospect of seeing her mother again, but we agreed that we must wait until morning. We planned... Oh, come in, Annie, he called suddenly. At his call, the shop door opened and shut. There was a rush of 2 pairs of feet through the shop. In the doorway appeared a young woman carrying a baby. Behind her came a little boy on crutches. Granny stood like a marble statue staring, but Maida screamed. Who do you suppose they were? They were Mrs. Dorr and Delia and Dickie. "Oh, my mother," Mrs. Dorr said. "My little Annie, my little girl," Granny murmured. The tears began to stream down her cheeks. Followed kissings and huggings by the dozen. Followed questions and answers by the score. "And to think you've been living near us all this time," Granny said after the excitement had died down. She was sitting on the couch now, with Delia asleep in her lap. Mrs. Dorr on one side and Dickie on the other. She cuddled Delia close. "Oh, I'm the happiest woman in the whole wide world this day." It was arranged that the 2 families were to have Christmas dinner together. Dickie and Mrs. Dorr hurried back for a few moments to bring their turkey to the feast. "Granny, will you love me just the same now that you've got Dickie and Delia?" Maida said wistfully. "Love you, my lamb? Of course I'll love you all the more, for it was through you I met Mr. Billy, and through Mr. Billy I found my Annie." When Mrs. Dorr returned, mother and daughter went to work on the dinner, while Billy and Maida and Dickie trimmed the tree. When the door opened, they caught bits of conversation. Granny's brogue growing thicker and thicker in her excitement, and Mrs. Dorr relapsing under its influence into old country speech. At such times, Maida noticed that Billy's eyes always scrinkled up. They were just putting the finishing touches to the tree when the window darkened suddenly. Maida looked up in surprise, and then, "Oh, my papa's come," she screamed. "My papa's come to my Christmas tree after all." There is so much to tell about the Christmas tree that I don't know where to begin. First of all came Laura and Harold. Mrs. Lathrop stopped with them for a moment to congratulate Mrs. Dorr on finding her mother. "Mrs. Lathrop, permit me to introduce my father, Mr. Westerbrook," Maida said. Mrs. Lathrop was very gracious. "The neighborhood have accepted your daughter as Mrs. Flynn's grandchild, Mr. Westerbrook, but I guessed the truth from the first. I believed, however, that you wished the matter kept a secret, and I have said nothing of it to anybody." "I thank you, madam," said Buffalo Westerbrook, bending on her one of his piercing scrutinies. However the neighborhood accepted her, they have given her back her health. I can never be too grateful to them. Came Rosie next with a, "Oh, Maida, if you could only have seen Edward when my mother bathed him tonight." Came Arthur, came the Doyles, came the Clark twins with Betsy tagging at their heels. Last of all, to Maida's great delight, came Dr. Pierce. Nobody was allowed to go into the shop where the tree stood until the last guest had arrived, but in spite of their impatience, they had a gay half-hour of waiting. Billy amused them with all kinds of games and tricks and jokes, and when he tired, Dr. Pierce, who soon became a great favorite, took them in hand. Dr. Pierce sat most of the evening holding Betsy in his lap, listening to her funny baby chatter and roaring at her escapades. He took a great fancy to the Clark twins and made all manner of fun for the children by pretending that there was only one of them. "Goodness, how do you fly about?" he would say ruefully to Dorothy. "An instant ago you were standing close beside me," or "How can you be here on the couch?" he would say to Mabel, "when there you are as plain as pikestaff standing up in the corner." "What can you do about that leg, Ellie?" Mr. Westabrook asked Dr. Pierce once when Dickie swung across the room. "I've been thinking about that," Dr. Pierce answered briskly. "I guess Granny and Annie will have to let me take Dickie for a while. A few months in my hospital, and he'll be jumping round here like a frog with the toothache." "Oh, Dr. Pierce, do you think you can cure him?" Mrs. Dorr asked, clasping her hands. "Cure him?" Dr. Pierce answered with his jolliest laugh. "Of course we can. He's not in half so bad a condition as Maida was when we straightened her out. Grindschmidt taught us a whole bag of tricks. Dickie could almost mend himself if he'd only stay still long enough. Look at Maida. Would you ever think she'd been much worse than Dickie?" Everybody stared hard at Maida, seated on her father's knee, and she dimpled and blushed under the observation. She was dressed all in white ribbons, white sash, white socks and shoes, the softest, filmiest white cobweb dress. Her hair streamed loose, a cascade of delicate clinging ringlets of the palest gold. Her big gray eyes, soft with happiness of the long day, reflected the firelight. Her cheeks had grown round as well as pink and dimpled. She did not look sick. "Oh, Dickie," she cried, "just think, you're going to be cured. Didn't I tell you when my father saw you he'd fix it all right? My father's a magician." But Dickie could not answer. He was gulping furiously to keep back the tears of delight, but he smiled his radiant smile. Billy took everybody's attention away from him by turning an unexpected cartwheel in the middle of the floor. Finally, Maida announced that it was time for the tree. They formed in line and marched into the shop to a tune that Billy thumped out of the silver-toned old spinet. I wish you could have heard the things the children said. The tree went close to the ceiling. Just above it, with arms outstretched, swung a beautiful Christmas angel. Hanging from it were all kinds of glittery, quivery, sparkly things in silver and gold. Festooned about it were strings of popcorn and cranberries. At every branch tip glistened a long glass icicle, and the whole thing was ablaze with candles and veiled in a mist of gold and silver. At the foot of the tree, groups of tiny figures in painted plaster told the whole Christmas Day story, from the moment of the first sight of the star by the shepherds who watched their flocks to the arrival at the manger of the wise men bearing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Billy Potter disappeared for a moment and came in presently, the most chubby and pink-faced and blue-eyed of Santa Clauses, in purple velvet trimmed with ermine, with long white hair and a long white beard. I can't begin to name to you all the fruits of that magic tree. From Maida, there came to Rosie a big golden cage with a pair of canary birds. To Arthur, a chest of wonderful tools. To Dickie, a little bookcase full of beautiful books. To Laura, a collection of sashes and ribbons. To Harold, a long train of cars. For Molly, Betsy, and the Clark twins came so many gifts that you could hardly count them all. Dolls and dolls' wardrobes, tiny doll houses and tinier doll furniture. For Tim came a sled and bicycle. To Maida came a wonderful set of paper boxes from Dickie, a long necklace of carved beads from Arthur, a beautiful blank book with all her candy recipes beautifully written out from Rosie, a warm little pair of knitted bed shoes from Granny, a quaint little old-fashioned locket from Dr. Pierce. He said it had once belonged to another little sick girl who died. From Billy came a book. Perhaps you can fancy how Maida jumped when she read The Crystal Ball by William Potter on the cover. But I don't think you can imagine how pleased she looked when inside she read the printed dedication, To Petronilla. From her father came a beautiful miniature of her mother painted on ivory. The children crowded about her to see the beautiful face of which Maida had told them so much. There was the mass of golden hair which she had described so proudly. There, too, was a heart-shaped pendant of diamonds suspended from a black velvet ribbon tied close to the white throat. The children looked at the picture. Then they looked at each other. But Maida did not notice. She was watching eagerly while Dr. Pierce and Billy and her father opened her gifts to them. She was afraid they would not understand. They're to save time, you see, when you want to shave in a hurry, she explained. Maida, her father said gravely, that is a very thoughtful gift. It's strange when you come to think of it. As busy a man as I am and with all the friends I have, nobody has ever thought to give me a safety razor. I don't know how I ever managed to get along without one, Dr. Pierce declared, his curls bobbing. As for me, I shall probably save about a third of my income in the future, Billy announced. All three were so pleased that they laughed for a long time. I'm going to give you another Christmas gift, Maida, Mr. Westerbrook said suddenly. I'm going to give us both one, a vacation. We're going to start for Europe week after next. Oh, Papa, how lovely, Maida said. Shall we see Venice again? But how can I give up my little shop and my friends? Maida going away? The children exclaimed. Oh dear, oh dear. But Mr. Westerbrook, isn't Maida coming back again? Rosie asked. How I shall miss her, Laura chimed in. Take my lamb away, Granny wailed. Sure she'll get sick in those wild countries. You'll have to take me with you, Mr. Westerbrook. Only... She did not finish her sentence, but her eyes went anxiously to her daughter's face. No, Granny, you're not to go, Mr. Westerbrook said decisively. You're to stay right here with your daughter and her children. You're all to run the shop and live over it. Maida's old enough and well enough to take care of herself now. And I think she'd better begin to take care of me as well. Don't you think so, Maida? Of course I do, Papa. If you need me, I want to. Mr. Westerbrook, Molly broke into the conversation determinedly. Did you ever give Maida a pair of ponies? Mr. Westerbrook bent on the robin the most amused of his smiles. Yes, he said. And an automobile? Tim asked. Mr. Westerbrook turned to the bogle. Yes, he said, a little puzzled. And did Maida's mother have a gold brush with her initials in diamonds on it? Rosie asked. Mr. Westerbrook roared. Yes, he said. And have you got 12 peacocks, 2 of them white? Arthur asked. Yes. And has Maida a little theater of her own and a dollhouse as big as a cottage? Laura asked. Yes. And did she have a May party last year that she invited over 400 children to? Harold asked. Yes. And did you give her weight in silver dollars once? Mabel asked. Yes. And a family of 20 dolls? Dorothy asked. Yes. You shall see all these things when we come back, Mr. Westerbrook promised. Then why did she run away? Betsy asked solemnly. Everybody laughed. I always said Maida was a princess in disguise, Dickie maintained. And now I suppose she's going back and be a princess again. Dickie was the first friend I made, Papa, Maida said, smiling at her first friend. But you'll come back sometime, won't you, Maida? Dickie begged. Yes, Dickie, Maida answered. I'll come back. Yes, Maida did come back, and what fun they all have. The little 6 in their private quarters, and the big 6 with their picnics and their adventures with the gypsies, is told in Maida's little house. And so, sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.